This story is a work of fiction, a dramatized emotional narrative inspired by public fascination with legacy, memory, and unanswered questions. It is not presented as historical fact. There are things we write knowing they may never be read. And then there are things we write because, deep down, we know they must be. I wrote the letter on a quiet night when the house finally stopped echoing with other people's expectations. No cameras, no music playing. Just the soft hum of the city outside and the sound of my own breathing reminding me that time, no matter how famous you are, always keeps moving. I didn't intend it to be dramatic. I didn't even intend it to be final. But something inside me knew. I had lived most of my life with my voice filling arenas, with strangers deciding who I was based on what they heard for 4 minutes at a time. I had sung joy, heartbreak, strength, faith, sometimes before I fully understood those emotions myself. And yet, the truest things about me had always existed in silence. The letter was meant to hold those truths. I sat at the dining table with a single lamp on, pen heavy in my hand, staring at the blank page longer than I expected. What do you leave behind when the world already thinks it owns you? What do you say when every word can be misinterpreted, rearranged, or weaponized? I started over 3 times. Each version felt too careful, too edited, like something written for an audience instead of a soul. So I stopped trying to sound strong. I wrote as the woman who had been loved loudly and judged even louder. As someone who had survived applause and loneliness in equal measure. As someone who knew that fame doesn't protect you from fear, it just teaches you how to hide it better. The letter wasn't addressed to the public. That was important. It wasn't for headlines or documentaries or debates. It was for the people who knew pieces of me but never the whole picture. And for the people who thought they knew me at all. I wrote about love I never spoke about. About regrets that didn't fit into interviews. About choices that looked different from the inside than they ever did from the outside. I wrote about strength, not the kind people clapped for, but the quiet kind that keeps you alive when no one is watching. At one point, my hand shook so badly I had to set the pen down. Not because I was afraid of dying, but because I was afraid of being misunderstood one last time. When I finished, I folded the paper carefully. I didn't seal it. I didn't label it. I simply placed it where I knew it would eventually be found. Not immediately, not conveniently, but inevitably. I told myself it was just a precaution. But as I turned off the lamp and walked away, I felt something settle in my chest. Not sadness, not peace, but clarity. Because no matter how the world remembered my voice, this letter would remember me. And one day when it surfaced, it would surprise everyone. Not because of what it revealed, but because of how much of me had been missing all along. I didn't think of it as a goodbye. That's the part people get wrong when they imagine a letter written before the end. They picture drama, finality, a woman standing at the edge of something irreversible. But that night I was just tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. The kind of tired that settles in your bones after years of being strong for everyone except yourself. The house was quiet, unusually so. No assistants moving around, no phones ringing, no voices reminding me where I needed to be next. I had sent everyone home earlier than usual, claiming I needed rest. That wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. I sat alone in the living room, lights dimmed, my reflection faintly visible in the darkened windows. Somewhere in the distance, a siren passed and faded, like everything else eventually does. I held a mug of tea that had already gone cold, untouched, forgotten. My mind drifted backward, the way it often did when the noise finally stopped. I thought about the little girl who sang in church, who believed her voice was a gift meant to serve something bigger than herself. I thought about how quickly that gift turned into a responsibility, then a burden, then a battlefield where everyone had an opinion about how I should sound, behave, exist. Fame teaches you to split yourself in two. There's the woman people see, polished, powerful, smiling even when it hurts. And then there's the woman behind closed doors, asking questions no one wants to hear the answers to. I had spent decades protecting one at the expense of the other. That night, the second woman finally asked to be heard. I stood and walked to the small writing desk tucked into the corner of the room. It had been there for years, mostly decorative, mostly ignored. I opened the drawer and found a pad of paper and a pen, both untouched. That felt symbolic in a way I couldn't explain. I sat down slowly. The blank page waited. What do you say when words are the only thing you'll leave behind? I whispered to myself. I thought about my family. About love that had been complicated by expectations and misunderstandings. About conversations that never happened because we assumed there would always be more time. Time is generous until it suddenly isn't. I thought about the public. About how people spoke about me as if I were an idea instead of a person. Strong 1 minute. Broken the next. Cautionary tale. Never just human. The pen hovered over the page. I started writing my name at the top. Then I stopped. This wasn't about branding. Or legacy. Or control. So I didn't sign it. I wrote instead about fear. The kind that follows you even when you're winning. About loneliness in crowded rooms. About how applause can be deafening and still not drown out self-doubt. I wrote about faith, not as a performance, but as a struggle. About how believing doesn't always mean feeling safe. At one point, my phone buzzed on the table behind me. I ignored it. Whoever it was could wait. This moment couldn't. I wrote about mistakes I had made and mistakes that had been made about me. About how easily the world confuses pain with weakness. About how often I was punished not for failing, but for failing publicly. My hand cramped. Kept writing anyway. Because once you start telling the truth to yourself, stopping feels like betrayal. When I finished the first page, I turned it over and continued. Then another. And another. The words came faster, heavier, as if they had been waiting years for permission. I didn't cry. That surprised me. Instead, I felt clear. Exposed but grounded. Like someone who finally set down a weight she'd been carrying without realizing it. When I was done, I stacked the pages neatly and folded them once. Just once. I didn't put them in an envelope. I didn't label them. I simply held them in my hands for a long moment, feeling the paper tremble slightly with my breath. Not yet, I said softly, unsure who I was speaking to. I placed the letter somewhere deliberate. Somewhere private but not hidden. Somewhere it would be found, eventually, by someone who knew the difference between secrets and truths. As I turned off the lamp and walked away, I felt an unexpected unease ripple through me. Not fear. Recognition. Like I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. And for the first time that night, a thought surfaced that made me pause in the doorway, heart tightening just slightly. What if this letter wasn't just something I wrote? What if it was something I needed to leave behind? The letter didn't leave my thoughts after that night. It followed me the way a melody does when you can't quite remember where you first heard it, only that it refuses to fade. I went back to my routines, to the outward shape of my life, but something had shifted beneath the surface. Writing those words had opened a door I'd spent years keeping locked. And once opened, it wouldn't close quietly. The next morning, my house filled again with sound. The step, voices, phones vibrating on tables. The world returning to claim its space. I moved through it automatically, smiling when expected, nodding when spoken to, responding with a version of myself everyone felt comfortable recognizing. But inside I was elsewhere. Every question people asked me felt incomplete. Every plan felt temporary. I found myself listening more than speaking, watching people's faces as if I were seeing them for the last time. Not dramatically, not tragically, just with an unfamiliar attentiveness. "Whitney, you okay?" my assistant asked as we drove across town. "I'm fine," I said. And I meant it in the way people mean it when they don't want to explain. We arrived at the studio late morning. The place smelled like cables, coffee, and memories. I'd recorded so much of my life within walls like these that they felt almost sacred. Music had always been my refuge, the one place where truth could exist without explanation. But even there, something felt different. As I stepped into the vocal booth, the glass separating me from the control room reflected my face back at me. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not because she looked older or tired, but because she looked honest. I sang the take cleanly. Powerfully. Everyone applauded. Still, I felt unsettled. During a break, I sat alone on a couch in the hallway, scrolling absent-mindedly through my phone. Headlines flashed past. Opinions, praise, criticism. None of it felt personal anymore. It felt distant, like commentary on a life adjacent to mine, not fully overlapping. My phone buzzed with a message from someone I hadn't heard from in a long time. "Are you okay?" No greeting. No explanation. Just that. I stared at it longer than I should have. "How do you know to ask that?" Type back. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "Call me," the reply came. I didn't. Instead, I put the phone face down and stood up, heart beating faster than necessary. The question echoed louder than the message itself. "How did you know?" That afternoon, I had a meeting with people who spoke in careful language and measured concern. They asked about future projects, about commitments, about timelines that stretched months and years ahead. I answered professionally, but my mind kept drifting back to the folded pages resting quietly where I'd left them. The letter felt heavier now. Not because of what it said, but because of what it might become. That night, after everyone left and the house settled into silence again, I went back to where I'd placed it. I didn't open it. I just touched it, fingertips grazing the edge of the paper, as if confirming it was still real. "What are you?" I whispered. A confession. A warning. A goodbye. Triggering. I thought about who would find it one day. Who would read it? Who would misunderstand it? Who would use it to build narratives I never intended? And then I realized something that made my chest tighten. I hadn't decided who it was for. The thought unsettled me deeply. Because leaving something behind without choosing its recipient meant surrendering control. And control was something I had fought to maintain my entire life, sometimes to my own detriment. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring into nothing. What if the letter wasn't finished? What if the surprise wasn't its existence, but its purpose? My phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But something told me not to ignore this one. "Whitney," a familiar voice said. Too familiar. "We need to talk." "About what?" asked cautiously. "About something that shouldn't exist," the voice replied. "And yet does." My grip tightened on the glass. "What are you talking about?" Then quietly. "The letter." My breath caught. "How do you know about that?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "I know because," the voice said slowly, "you're not the only one who's noticed you've been preparing for something." The call ended before I could respond. I stood there frozen, heart racing, the silence around me suddenly oppressive. Someone knew. Not just that I was tired. Not just that I was reflective. They knew about the letter. And in that moment, a chilling realization settled in my mind with absolute clarity. Whatever I had written that night was no longer just mine. And if I didn't decide what it meant soon, someone else would. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear in the way people imagine fear. Sharp, panicked, overwhelming. It was quieter than that. More deliberate. The kind of fear that sits beside you and waits, patient, certain you'll eventually acknowledge it. Someone knew about the letter. That fact replayed in my mind with disturbing clarity. I went over every detail of that night. The silence, the locked doors, the way I had folded the pages. No assistants. No witnesses. No reason for anyone to even suspect its existence. Yet, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. The hum of electricity in the walls. The faint creak of wood settling. I wondered how many times in my life I had mistaken privacy for safety. By morning, exhaustion wrapped around me like a second skin. I canceled my first appointment of the day and told my team I needed space. They didn't argue. They rarely did when my tone carried that particular finality. Fame teaches people when not to push. I spent the morning moving slowly through the house, touching things as if committing them to memory. The piano bench worn smooth from years of use. A framed photograph on the wall, slightly crooked. A scarf draped over a chair, forgotten. It wasn't nostalgia. It was awareness. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, phone beside me. I didn't check messages. I didn't turn on the television. I just sat there, breathing, until a thought surfaced that made my chest tighten. What if the letter wasn't discovered by accident? What if it was being looked for? The idea unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I had always understood that my life attracted attention, but this felt different. More intentional. More invasive. By noon I couldn't stay inside anymore. I drove without a destination, windows down, letting the noise of the city drown out my thoughts. At a red light, a group of strangers recognized me. Mail. Waves. Phones lifted discreetly. I waved back automatically. They saw strength. They always did. I met someone that afternoon I hadn't planned to see. An old friend who knew me before the world did. We sat in a quiet cafe tucked away from the main streets. No entourage. No headlines. "You seem different," she said after a while, studying my face. "I feel different," I admitted. She didn't press. She never had. We talked about small things. Memories. Music. Life. The kind of conversation that exists without performance. At one point, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You don't owe anyone everything," she said gently. "Remember that." I nodded, but the words landed heavier than she intended. Because what if I already had? When I returned home that evening, the house felt wrong immediately. Not visibly altered. Not disturbed. Just the air carried a tension I couldn't name. I stood in the entryway, keys still in my hand, listening. Nothing. Slowly, I walked toward the room where I had placed the letter. My heart beat faster with every step. The drawer was closed. Exactly as I'd left it. Exhaled too soon. Then I noticed it. The drawer was closed. But not aligned. It was subtle. Almost imperceptible. A fraction of an inch off. Something only someone deeply familiar with their own space would notice. My mouth went dry. Opened it. The letter was there. But it wasn't exactly the same. The stack felt lighter. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the pages. I counted them once. Then again. One page was missing. I stood there frozen, the reality settling slowly, painfully. Someone hadn't just found the letter. They had taken part of it. My phone rang. I didn't jump. I expected it. "Whitney," a voice said calmly when I answered. Not the same voice from before. This one was lower. Colder. Professional. "You're very good at expressing yourself." My blood ran cold. "What do you want?" I asked. Soft chuckle. "We want to make sure you don't accidentally hurt yourself." "Hurt myself," I repeated. "Reputations are fragile," the voice continued. "So are narratives. A single page, taken out of context, can say many things." My grip tightened around the phone. "You broke into my home," I said. "No," the voice replied smoothly. "We protected your legacy." Laughed once. Dark. Disbelieving. "By stealing my words." "By holding them," the voice corrected. "Until you decide what kind of ending you want." The call ended. I stared at the phone in my hand, my reflection faintly visible on its dark screen. They had a piece of my truth. And suddenly, the letter was no longer just a confession. It was leverage. I sat down slowly, the weight of it pressing into my chest. Because now I understood something terrifying. This wasn't about the past. It was about control over what would be remembered. And unless I acted quickly, my own words could be used to erase me. The fear didn't come all at once. It arrived in layers, slow and suffocating, like realizing you're underwater only after your lungs start to burn. Someone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They hadn't just invaded my home. They had invaded my voice, my private truth. And now they were holding it hostage. I didn't call the police. That surprised even me. But I understood something instinctively. This wasn't a crime that would be solved by uniforms and reports. This was about power. About narratives. About who gets to decide how a life is remembered when the person living it no longer gets to speak. I spent the night sitting on the floor of my bedroom, back against the bed, letter pages spread in front of me like evidence from my own soul. I reread what remained, searching for the missing page's ghost, the emotional gap it left behind. I knew exactly which page it was. The most vulnerable one. The one where I admitted uncertainty, regret, fear. The one where I questioned the version of myself the world loved most. Out of context, it could be twisted into weakness, instability, collapse. That was the point. By morning, I made a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable. I would not hide. If someone wanted to control my ending, they would have to do it in the open. I went to rehearsal that afternoon for an upcoming appearance, a high-profile charity event with cameras, donors, press. Exactly the kind of place where rumors thrive. As soon as I walked backstage, I felt it. A shift. The glances that lingered half a second too long. Conversations that stopped when I entered. Something was already moving. "Whitney," my manager said, stepping in front of me, voice tight. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I asked calmly. He hesitated. "There's concern." That word again. Concern. Always dressed up to sound like care. "About what?" I asked. He lowered his voice. "About your stability. About things you may have written. Things that, if released without context, could be damaging." My heart didn't race. It hardened. "So you've seen it," I said. He didn't deny it. That was the betrayal. Not the theft. Not the threats. But the confirmation that someone I trusted had chosen control over truth. "I didn't give you permission," I said quietly. "You didn't need to," he replied. "This is bigger than you now. Bigger than me." Those words echoed in my head as I walked away from him, onto the dimly lit stage for rehearsal. The spotlight flicked on, blinding for a second. Muscle memory took over. Sang. Perfectly. Powerfully. But something in the air felt wrong. Halfway through the song, the monitors crackled. Feedback screamed. The lights flickered, then went out completely. The music cut. Gasps filled the space. For a moment, I stood in total darkness, heart pounding. Not from fear, from clarity. This wasn't an accident. Backstage erupted into chaos. Technicians rushed. Voices overlapped. Accusations flew. I stayed where I was, breathing steadily, listening. "This doesn't just happen," someone said nearby. "No," I murmured to myself. "It doesn't." They wanted me rattled, vulnerable, publicly unstable. I walked off stage before anyone could stop me. In the hallway, my phone buzzed. Message. No number. Just text. "You see how easily things fall apart when you don't cooperate." I stared at the screen, then typed back. "You underestimate me." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then another message. "We're trying to protect you." I laughed out loud. A sharp, humorless sound that startled the people nearby. Protection doesn't come with threats. Protection doesn't steal your words. That night, the story broke before I could stop it. Anonymous sources. Vague language. Phrases like deep concern. Private writings. Emotional struggles. They never quoted the letter directly. They didn't need to. Doubt spreads faster than truth. I watched the coverage in silence, sitting alone again, the glow of the television painting my face in harsh light. They were laying the groundwork, preparing the audience, softening them for whatever came next. And I understood then what the external conflict truly was. This wasn't about me losing control. It was about me being discredited before I could speak. If they made the world question my credibility, then when the letter surfaced, altered, partial, manipulated, it would confirm the story they wanted told. I turned off the TV. Enough waiting. I picked up the phone and called the one person I hadn't wanted to involve. The one person who knew how this industry really worked. When they answered, I didn't waste time. "They took a page from my letter," I said. "And they're planning to use it." Then a low, serious voice. "Then you have very little time," they replied. "Because once they release it, you don't get to take it back." Closed my eyes. Then help me, I said. Another pause. I will, they answered. But you need to understand something first. What? Asked. This isn't just about the letter anymore, they said. It's about who's been watching you for much longer than you realize. The line went dead. I sat there in the silence, heart pounding, the weight of the truth settling over me. Because if that was true, then the letter wasn't the beginning of the danger. It was the reason it had finally surfaced. The hardest part wasn't fear anymore. It was clarity. Once you see the shape of the trap, you can't unsee it. Every conversation, every sudden concern, every carefully worded article began to line up into something deliberate. I hadn't been spiraling. I had been studied, managed, positioned. The person I called met me the next morning in a place chosen specifically because no one ever looked twice at it. A plain office building with no name on the door, no cameras in the lobby, no history. The kind of place secrets went to breathe. They didn't waste time. You've been considered a liability for a while, they said, folding their hands on the table. Not because you're unstable. Because you're unpredictable. I felt my jaw tighten. Unpredictable how? You still speak for yourself, they replied. You haven't learned to disappear behind handlers. That scares people who make money off consistency. So they steal my words. Yes. Sabotage my work. Leak doubts about my sanity. They create a narrative, the person said calmly. So when you finally tell the truth, it sounds like confirmation instead of revelation. I leaned back in the chair, a slow, bitter understanding settling into my chest. The missing page. It wasn't just vulnerable. It was inconvenient. Do you know what was on the page they took? Asked. They nodded. Enough. My pulse quickened. Enough for what? To dismantle you gently, they said. Not all at once. Over time. So no one notices who pushed. Closed my eyes. That page talked about exhaustion. About doubt. About moments where I questioned whether I could survive being myself in a world that preferred me curated. Out of context, it could sound like collapse. Like confession of failure. Why not release the whole thing? I asked quietly. Because the rest shows awareness, they replied. Strength, reflection, agency. That doesn't serve them. Silence stretched between us. What do I do? Asked. They studied me for a long moment. You take control of the timing. How? You decide how the letter enters the world, they said. Not as a leak. Not as a scandal. As intention. I shook my head. If I release it, they'll say I'm unstable. If I don't, they'll release the page and say I'm hiding. Then you don't release the letter, they said. You release your voice. I looked up. You tell your story before they tell it for you, they continued. Publicly. Only. On your terms. The thought terrified me. Not because I couldn't speak, but because speaking would end the illusion of safety I'd been clinging to. Once I stepped forward, there would be no pretending this was just industry noise. I left that meeting with a decision forming slowly, painfully. That night, I sat again at the desk where the letter had been born. I reread the remaining pages one last time. They didn't feel fragile anymore. They felt honest. I took a breath and began writing again. Not to replace the missing page, but to confront it. I wrote about control. About manipulation disguised as care. About how easily concern becomes a weapon when power is involved. I didn't name names. I didn't accuse directly. I didn't need to. Truth has a way of pointing without pointing. When I finished, I placed the new page with the others. Not as a correction but as a declaration. If they wanted pieces of my truth, I would give them a whole voice instead. The next morning I agreed to an interview. Not a defensive one. Conversation. My team panicked. My phone rang non-stop. Warnings. Suggestions. Thinly veiled threats dressed as advice. Now isn't the time, they said. Let us handle it, they said. Think about your image, they said. I thought about my life instead. The studio lights were bright, unforgiving. I sat across from the interviewer, hands folded, posture steady. No theatrics, no breakdown. Just me. Whitney, the interviewer said carefully. There have been rumors about private writings, about your emotional state. Do you want to address that? Yes, I said. Simply. The room seemed to lean forward. I've written things privately, I continued. Like anyone who reflects, like anyone who feels deeply. Writing isn't a weakness. It's awareness. And no one has the right to decide which parts of my voice are acceptable. Somewhere, someone watching realized they were losing control. I could feel it. I spoke about boundaries, about narrative ownership, about how fame doesn't erase personhood. I never mentioned the letter directly, but everyone knew. When the interview ended, I felt lighter and exposed. That's when my phone buzzed again. Message. You just made this worse. I stared at it, heart steady now. No, I typed back. I made it visible. Seconds later, another message appeared. Then you leave us no choice. My breath caught. I looked up at my reflection in the darkened screen, recognizing the woman staring back. Where? Ready. Because if they thought visibility was dangerous, they were about to learn what happens when silence ends. When you live long enough under observation, you learn something strange about fear. Doesn't disappear when the threat does. It disappears when you stop negotiating with it. The days after the interview were eerily quiet. No more anonymous messages. No more concerned phone calls wrapped in authority. The machine had stalled, unsure of its next move. Visibility had done what secrecy never could. It exposed the shape of what had been hiding in the dark. But I knew better than to think this would end cleanly. The letter still existed. And so did the missing page. I met again with the person who had warned me. This time there was no urgency in their voice. Only finality. They won't release it now, they said. Not after the interview. Not after the shift in public tone. So it's over. Yes. They shook their head. No. It's contained. Contained. Like a threat locked in a drawer. What happens to the page? Yes. It disappears, they said. Or it resurfaces years from now, stripped of power, when it can no longer control you. I nodded slowly. That was the truth about narratives. Timing is everything. When I returned home that evening, I didn't rush to the desk. I didn't touch the remaining pages right away. Instead, I walked through the house with intention. I opened windows. Let air move through rooms that had held too much silence. When I finally sat down, I unfolded the letter one last time. I read it not as evidence, but as memory. I recognized the woman who wrote it. Not broken, not fragile, but deeply aware. A woman who understood that legacy isn't about perfection. It's about honesty surviving distortion. I took a deep breath and made a decision that surprised even me. I sealed the letter. Not to hide it, but to protect it. I placed it where it would eventually be found. Not by the industry, not by opportunists, not by people hungry for narrative power, but by someone who would read it without needing to own it. That mattered. Because the letter was never meant to explain me. It was meant to free me. In the weeks that followed, I focused on music again. Not as escape, but as grounding. Singing felt different now. Less like performance. More like conversation. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The rumors faded. The headlines moved on. They always do. But something permanent had changed. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of how the story would end. Because I understood something I hadn't before. Endings only control you when you let other people write them. I had spent years being edited, trimmed into something marketable, digestible, safe. That letter was the first thing I'd written without imagining how it would be received. And that's why it scared them. Truth that doesn't ask permission always does. Sometimes late at night I think about the page that was taken. I imagine it resurfacing someday, alone, stripped of context. And I smile, not because it wouldn't hurt but because it wouldn't matter. Because by then, the rest of my voice would already exist in the world. Complete. Unedited. I don't know when the letter will be found. I don't know who will read it first. But I know this. When it finally surfaces, it won't surprise people because it reveals something shocking. It will surprise them because it reveals how much of me was never truly heard. And maybe, just maybe, it will remind someone else that being misunderstood is not the same thing as being wrong. Sometimes it's the price of being honest. Reflection. This story isn't about a letter. It's about ownership. A voice of truth, of legacy. It's about what happens when someone refuses to let fear decide how they're remembered. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications to never miss the next story.